Well, good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this month, July, we are doing a special series called McDuff Matters on Monday nights. And this is the second part of the series. Tonight, I'm going to focus on my father's career at SACSA, SACSA. Oh my gosh, I had my SACSA mug. I was going to show you where did I put it? Well, tell you what. I want you to see this SACSA mug, so I'll be right back. Oh, I know where it is. I hid it in plain sight. Hey, Kathy Sue, David, and Corky. Oh, Corky. Tim Judd is here. Great violinist, Tim Judd. Thanks for being with us again, Tim. And ECAT, Paul Engelbrecht. Hello, Paul. And Freedom Rings here at McDuff Channel. Okay, so I stuck this up here so I wouldn't lose it, and now I remember where I put it. That's the way my brain works sometimes. But when I talk about my dad, I get a little bit nervous. Want to do everything right. So here, let's start with this. This is a mug that my dad got in the toward the end of his life. I'm going to say in early '71, maybe. It was the 10th year anniversary of SACSA, but I don't think SACSA existed until it might have been closer to 9 years, but this was called the 10th year anniversary mug. You can see this is. I just want you to see this. My dad's name on the back of the mug. So because honestly, how many things do I have that prove that my dad worked for SACSA? Well, this is one of them, and uh, this actually was going to be one of our giveaway gifts when Andy DeBala of Neighborhood News Studio were putting together a package of bonus gifts when we had but that was before we got demonetized over at YouTube. So anyway, we will persevere and try to get some of these made. But I think that if there's ever any questions, just take a look at this video. Here's the mug. Okay. So again, let's start with kind of a SACSA 101. What is or was SACSA? It was the special assistant to the president for counterinsurgency and special activities. Why was there somebody called the SACSA? Because President Kennedy ordered it. And this order, I believe, was started in '61. So, fair enough. But my dad joined the outfit near the beginning in March or April of 1962. And he was coming from the FBI, which is really kind of something that I've still not completely understood. What was it about my dad, the FBI agent, that made him particularly qualified to be the special operations planner for counterinsurgency at the Pentagon? And this is where I've been forced to look into his entire career. And I think there's a lot of stuff in the Navy that we haven't found yet. Specifically, I do think that he was an intelligence officer and probably was in charge of security at some high level, even back then. Because this is what Doug Valentine told me the last time we spoke, which was on the show about 2 weeks ago. was that, the military would have had a senior security guy to check out somebody going out on a mission like TDY. TDY referring to Doug Valentine's book of that name about a special mission to go out and try to catch the CIA doing drug deals in Laos in 1967. Um, so, one of the amazing miracles that has happened since I started this study is to get to know Doug Valentine's work and to talk to him a number of times and to find that he's absolutely sure that this man that he wrote about in his book is my dad, the guy that sent these people out on this mission to try to catch the CIA. So I'm kind of proud of that my dad was involved in an effort to stop the CIA's drug heroin business, the Hellowell plan. That's one of the main reasons that I really wanted to write the book, to make sure that people had a chance to know the details as best as I can, and that's what I spent the last 4 years doing, is trying to put together, which is not even quite 100 pages, but there's a lot of great detail that I was able to put together. Um, in the book, I talk about SACSA. Let's start on page 40. SACSA, to direct special operations in the Kennedy administration, the Joint Chiefs of Staff created a new organization headed by a general officer with the title Special Assistant for Counterintelligence and Special Activities, SACSA. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty of the Air Force Special Operations Command was tasked with forming the new organization. The Kennedy administration wanted to have a new team, so General Ed Lansdale, a CIA man who had run special operations since the CIA-sponsored Hook Rebellion in the Philippines, was passed over. The new SACSA official was to have control over all special operations, including those of the CIA, which was ordered to turn its special operations files over to the Joint Chiefs. To staff the office, an operations planner was needed, someone who was familiar with intelligence and special operations, but not a CIA man. Moreover, Kennedy needed someone who would be respected by all the services and intelligence agencies for honesty, trustworthiness, and reliability. That person would have custody, sole personal custody, of all the special operations files of every such agency. So that is the story, and you should feel the tension there between the CIA, which doesn't want to give up its files. In fact, it wants to run everybody else's files, right? And the FBI, which hates the CIA, and the CIA hates the FBI, at least at the upper level, right? And then you have the Pentagon, which has their own issues. They don't like the CIA either. But it's the CIA that's been giving them all the work, they get to do all of these special ops because of the CIA. So by this point, 61, with Alan Dulles having been running the CIA for 10 years, he's put, as Fletcher Prouty explains in his books, he's put these CIA associated focal points throughout the military and throughout the Department of Defense, and has found a way to kind of insinuate the CIA into all the important sinews of our defense establishment. Here's from The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty. This is my well-worn copy I bought in 2014. Page 487. Then, as a progression of the first move, the Joint Staff created an office called the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, SACSA. The new office was much larger than the original office that had moved down from the Office of Secretary of Defense, and it brought with it a large staff of CIA oriented personnel from all services. It had several temporary special assistants before it acquired its greatest and most dynamic driving force, U.S. Marine General Victor H. Krulak. The important thing to understand is that the much heralded office of SACSA had very few military responsibilities. It was almost entirely CIA oriented. Most of its dealings with the services were in areas where the CIA was most active. For example, the great proportion of its dealing with the Army was strictly limited to Special Forces activity. With the Air Force, it was, for the most part, limited to special air warfare activity. And with the Navy, it was the SEALs. There were other duties, sorry, of course, but most of them gave the office something it could say it was doing while it performed its primary task of supporting the CIA, the secret team, and of breathing life into the massive Frankenstein called counterinsurgency. SACSA played another role, very important role in the highest level policy discussions of this country. It has been said that Kennedy wanted to get out of Vietnam in 1963, but deferred it until after his reelection, as he told Senator Mike Mansfield, because such a move would stir up a Joe McCarthy wave of sentiment and would lose him the support of the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs, Kennedy knew best, was the voice of SACSA. The one officer he saw from the Joint Staff more than any other during those critical days was General Krulak. In parentheses, it says, see how often Krulak's name appears in the Pentagon Papers, and then see if the name of General Dean ever appears. This was because Allen Dulles and Maxwell Taylor, at that time the military advisor to the president, opened the door for Krulak, since Krulak's job was to support the CIA. General Krulak's closest advisors were such men as Bill Bundy, a longtime CIA man on McNamara's staff, General Lansdale, and other key CIA agents and high officials whose names will be omitted because some of them are still active. That was Fletcher Prouty writing in 1972. As important to the secret team as SACSA was, of equal importance was the return to government and especially to the Pentagon of Maxwell Taylor. After the Bay of Pigs, it was inevitable that Allen Dulles would leave the CIA. His chief, Lieutenant Dick Bissell of U-2 fame and of Laos and Bay of Pigs infamy, left the agency to become head of the Institute of Defense Analysis, an organization with many interesting functions, among them acting as a conduit for CIA activities. Dulles again showed that uncanny ability of his and the agency's to rise above each fiasco to new heights. President Kennedy was enamored with the idea of counterinsurgency. All the books tell us that. But what we are missing is the distinction between what General Krulak called counterinsurgency and what we now think of when somebody says counterinsurgency. For instance, I think it was it's indicative to consider that Professor Hamamoto, who studied these things, was said to me, how did Victor Krulak get to know about counterinsurgency? He must have been in the Philippines, you know. In other words, he was maybe somebody that worked with Lansdale when Lansdale ran the Huck Rebellion in the early 50s, or perhaps he was with the CIA in Indonesia or in Central America. But no, Victor Krulak was a Marine general, and he ran Marine operations in World War II and the Korean War, and ultimately also in Vietnam. But General Krulak was looked to as the expert in counterinsurgency. Well, it wasn't because he had caused genocide in Vietnam or killed off the democratic leadership of Guatemala, or because he created terrorist incidents in Laos, or because he did uh, 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 horrific things in Korea. No, it wasn't any of that at all. He had written a number of papers and had studied the subject of how do you win a counterinsurgency battle. And I want to give him credit for that. Now, here is his biography, The Life of Victor Krulak, U.S. Marine, by Robert Coram. And let's see, this was published in 2010. And in this is a chapter that I think everybody needs to know about. It's called JFK and the Brute, meaning Brute Krulak, his nickname. Confront Vietnam. It's chapter 14 of this book. Krulak loved to tell the story of how in 1962 he showed up at the White House and announced, quote, "I want to see the president," explaining back then a general could go to the White House without an appointment and see the president. Krulak said that he arrived bearing a bottle of Three Feathers whiskey that he had promised JFK back in on Vela La Vela some 19 years earlier, and that Kennedy remembered the promise. He said, "Well, why don't we have a drink of this stuff?" Krulak claimed that he responded, "It isn't very good, Mr. President," but that he and Kennedy had a ritual drink and talked about the old days in the Pacific, about Choi Sewell and the young Marine who died in Kennedy's bunk aboard the PT boat. Well, that story has been challenged in many ways, and I think it's typical of perhaps some military types that are willing to remember things a little bit more intensely, so intensely that you actually believe them. Um, I don't think that that actually happened, but I do think that Kennedy's PT boat actually did rescue Krulak and his crew when they got stranded on some coral when they were executing a special operation during World War II in the Marines. So this, yeah, he knows special operations. Krulak certainly does. And Krulak was dual-hatted. As the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency, he was the government's top expert on counterinsurgency matters. As the Special Assistant for Special Activities, he held one of the most sensitive jobs in the U.S. government, liaison between the military and the CIA. This was the blackest of the black holes and involved some of the most highly classified matters of national defense. It meant that in Vietnam, Krulak was in charge of psychological warfare and covert activities against the enemy, a job that in a few years would be turned over to a much larger group and with the innocuous name Studies and Observations Group, the SOG. As had been true since his days in China, Krulak's influence was far out of proportion with his rank. As a two-star general, he was subordinate to almost everyone with whom he came into official contact. But that was a technicality. He reported to the Secretary of Defense and met regularly with the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, and Ambassador at Large Averell Harriman. As a result, he had as much influence as any four-star general in Washington, and more than most. Heady business for any military officer, but sheer nirvana for Krulak. Barring a serious mistake, he could receive a third star. As the Marine Corps had fewer than a half dozen three-star generals, this promotion would automatically make him a candidate for commandant and the accompanying fourth star. Few military officers in Washington had a brighter future than Brute Krulak. Krulak was the point man, the acknowledged expert in an area of the highest importance to the Kennedy administration, counterinsurgency. The Cold War was heating up, and JFK would have to deal with standoffs in Berlin, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and troubles in Congo, Laos, Angola, South Korea, the Dominican Republic, Tunisia, Brazil, and of course, Vietnam. He wanted a military capable of what he called a flexible response to such incidents. Kennedy sent out the word that further promotion of high-ranking military officers would depend on the degree to which they supported counterinsurgency. Reduced to basics, Krulak's job was to develop America's techniques for fighting a counterinsurgency war in Vietnam, and so develop programs that would enable JFK to measure America's progress and the progress of South Vietnam as an ally. To do this, Krulak had to push not only the reluctant American military and the slow-moving State Department, but also the American people to undergo a radical shift in their thinking about the war. This war was not about taking the hill. It was, to use the phrase of the time, about winning the hearts and minds of the people. Quote, protection is the most important thing you can bring to the people of South Vietnam, Krulak said. After that comes health, and after that, many things: land, prosperity, education, and privacy, to name a few. Some have written that as SACSA, Krulak was a strong proponent of traditional military doctrine, that he actively supported Kennedy's escalation in Vietnam. This is true, but at the same time, Krulak pushed his own ideas about a new form of war, usually without success. Indeed, in the counterinsurgency part of his White House job, Krulak was an abject failure. He never got access to the American military. He never got across to the American military or to the American people what a war of national liberation was all about, what the Vietnam War meant to the United States, and why America had a stake in Southeast Asia. One reason he failed was that the government itself did not understand these issues. To the Army, counterinsurgency meant widespread use of helicopters and the new doctrine of air mobility. We never learned there's no substitute for time, Krulak said. You don't change people's minds overnight. Time is very disruptive of all factors in wartime. The exigencies of war never allow enough time. In 1962, Krulak was at the heart of the most famous Vietnam stories of the Kennedy administration. And then he tells about the Krulak, Mendenhall Krulak mission. And I have described this on the show before about the time that Kennedy, and this is basically comes from Fletcher Prouty, that Kennedy sent Krulak along with Averell Harriman of the State Department's appointee, Mr. Mendenhall, to Vietnam, and they came back, and the two reports were completely opposite. Krulak saying they could win the war, but they needed to do proper counterinsurgency and support the people in the countryside and give them protection. Whereas Mendenhall said, no, no, these guys are losers. The government's all screwed up and they're going to lose. So SACSA is then in the position of trying to get the military to use winning the hearts and minds tactics. But of course, then there's the other complication, which is the fall of the Diem government in South Vietnam. And the Diem government fell on the 1st of November of 1963, 3 weeks before President Kennedy was assassinated. President Kennedy definitely was going to pull out of Vietnam by the end of 65. As said in the book, he felt politically he had to wait until he got reelected. And of course, we can talk about the assassination as being mainly to ensure that he didn't get reelected. But when Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency, this is where Krulak was completely shut down. Because Krulak was going around to all the people he could talk to saying, with papers in his hand saying, we've got to do counterinsurgency by the book. And he practically had written the book. I didn't have the reference here, but it was a presentation that he made to the Army War College, which basically was accepted. Oh, here it is. It's called Tactics and Techniques of Insurgency and Counterinsurgency, June 4th, 1962, at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. The speech was a historical look at insurgencies around the world, but Krulak, in speaking of Vietnam, said that America's terrifying array of military strength has no real identification with the counterinsurgency battle. He said that the battle in Vietnam was not found on some classic area of tactical terrain selected by one of the antagonists, but in nameless villages and hamlets. And the objective to be gained is not a hill or a city, but the hearts and minds of thousands of little people without whose support there can be no victory. Doesn't that make sense? Without the support of the people, and this is what happens. So Johnson fires Krulak. Can't stand Krulak. And Krulak, get away from me with all this, hearts and minds stuff. You're making me sick. Give me Westmoreland. Give me the big army. Give me the thousands of helicopters. Give me the mobile force. And give me lots and lots of American soldiers that we can deploy out into the jungle and do what? Well, that's where they messed up. They didn't talk to people with experience of jungle fighting to realize that, it's not something for divisions and not something for set piece battles. Much better to win the hearts and minds than it is to try to basically persuade them by violence to be on your side, which is what they did. That's what the CIA's driven policy was. So after he fires Krulak, they bring in the next guy, who is General Anthus, General Roland Anthus. And General Roland Anthus is a Air Force general who has been, up to this point, running Operation Farmgate. And Operation Farmgate was the surreptitious use of American pilots, American Air Force pilots, in the so-called Vietnamese Air Force, the South Vietnamese Air Force. and they were flying missions under the colors of South Vietnam, but of course it was really Americans. And th- by doing that, they were doing bombing missions, of course, and they were doing it secretly. So you have already a guy that's been participating in CIA sponsored activities, and here he is now being brought in as the SACSA. Well, he was there for about a year. Let me see who was next. I think the next one. Oh, he wrote a nice letter for my dad. Uh, just to quote this, it's just a memorandum for my dad's, personnel file. Mr. O'Loughlin has performed his duties in a highly acceptable manner during this period. He has ably applied his knowledge in fulfilling the requirements of this office. He is loyal, conscientious, cheerful, dependable, and gets along well with others. He continues to display sound judgment and is always willing to work overtime or assist in any manner. His conduct is above reproach. And then there's a picture in here of him getting that award. I don't know how well you can see it. But so General Anthus leaves in 64. The next part of the book is about Barney Cochran and the talk with when this Air Force officer named Barney Cochran, I guess he's a colonel, uh, had been working in Laos in Operation Water Pump and Operation White Star, along with Bull Simons and General Donald Blackburn. He was transferred to the Pentagon, and this point, which I think is kind of the climax of my dad's life, really, is where I call it the talk on page 61. Um, they gave him a a couple of books to look through. One of which I've shown you is the book called Terror in Vietnam, and the other one was a short book about the Montagnards. And those two books were handed to him by, I believe, Barney Cochran himself and another guy, whoever it was. And when I asked my dad about them, I saw them. I wasn't supposed to look in that drawer, but I looked in that drawer and I saw them. And when I had a chance to, I asked him, and he said, "Oh, I gotta go. Those books belong to a couple of guys, and I didn't like what they were saying, so I got to give the books back to him." And my own studies, in my opinion, are that was a moment where things went really south for my dad because it was his. They introduced him to the fact that they were doing this Hellawell plan in Laos and running the heroin through Air America, which Barney Cochran was definitely um, very much aware of, if not participating in. And the idea that we were doing that would have been abhorrent to my dad, you know, just because he was a conservative guy. You don't want to, our American, you know, good guys. We're the good guys. We don't sell dope, which motivated him, I'm sure, to do the TDY mission, which Doug Valentine wrote about, where they tried and very nearly did catch the CIA buying dope from the Laotian drug lords in 1967. Well, General William Pierce was the next SACSA. General William Pierce is another person that knew intimately the uh, uh, opium trade, for he had been a veteran of Detachment 101 of the OSS in Burma during World War II. And he was in charge of the air operations. So, and then the Flying Tigers. So he had been intimately involved in the opium trade run through through Burma, the Flying Tigers, and the guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. He had joined the CIA when it was started in 1947. So there's no question that this guy, by the time of '67, when he is installed as the SACSA, that now we've got people that are clued in, OSS veteran, CIA veteran, uh, also a general, an Army general. So that is not part of the Victor Krulak Hearts and Minds counterinsurgency program. No, this is a drug operation. This is different. And, from so many things that we've read, it's sad to say, but it appears that the whole Vietnam War may have been, well, at least in one of its facets, one way to look at it is to look at it as a big operation of financing secret operations by selling heroin. And that's the kind of thing that would have been obvious to my dad. Look at these people that he's around. He's around all these people all the time. One of my favorite and most beloved books really is this one here, The Raid by Benjamin Schimmer, the Sante Prison Rescue Mission, the most daring operation of the Vietnam War, and it was run by SACSA. Okay, there's no question about that. This was a SACSA operation to free American pilots and other prisoners of war in a uh, secure location not far from Hanoi. In other words, deep in North Vietnam, to try to run a rescue operation. And as I've told you many times, the evidence to me is clear that my dad was involved, if not the main planner of this operation. And yet they took his name off of everything. You can't see his name associated with it. I find it impossible that my dad was not the primary planner for this operation. It just had to be, because that was his job. And the people that ran the operation were the same people that had been running everything from the water pump in Laos, to now, to MACV, to SOG, everything. These guys that are running these special operations. But I did want to read, if I can get a little light here. Oh, I know what to do. So this is Benjamin Schimmer, and again, this is a great account, very detailed, uh, published in 1976. So I like that, because the raid was 1970, so it was only 6 years later. So things are still fresh in the minds of the people he's interviewing, and the records are still available. So anyway, let me read a little bit of this. Page 34. SACSA. Not many of the 27,840 people who worked at the Pentagon in 1970 knew what the acronym SACSA meant. Fewer still had any inkling of what the group really did. It was headquartered in the prestigious E Ring just beneath the office of the Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. 5 United States Capitol buildings could rest comfortably within the Pentagon's walls, and 2.5 Washington monuments could be stretched end to end across the same space. So, proximity to the E Ring executives was an important indication of where an individual or office stood in the military's hierarchy. SACSA stood pretty close to the top. SACSA, and again, now we're in 1970, so it's a new SACSA, and it's the famous Donald D. Blackburn of Blackburn's Headhunters in World War II. Another coincidence that he was on Leyte and for the landing in October of 1944 when my dad was there with General MacArthur. Remarkable how these coincidences happen, but here he is again. SACSA was Donald D. Blackburn, a sandy-haired, 6 foot, 180-pound Army Brigadier General, the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He looked far younger than his 53 years, and after greeting Allen, Coulter, Isles, and Watkins that Monday morning, he picked up the telephone to ask a fifth man to join them from down the hall. It was Colonel E. Meyer, a tall, stocky North Dakota-born clandestine operator who looked like an affable, mild-mannered Midwestern farmer, but one whose patience should not be tested unnecessarily. There was something in his bearing that hinted he could break the average man in two with a sudden whack of his forearm. Meyer headed a small group in SACSA called the Special Operations Division. His work never made the newspapers. For one thing, it took more than a top secret or Q clearance to find out what special operations did. The 5 men sat down around a conference table. Then Allen and Watkins and Isles to go through the briefing they had prepared for the general, showing how the 1127th had positively identified prison compounds at both Aplo and Sante, and how they had pieced together the urgent request to rescue the six prisoners held captive at Sante. The briefing over, Allen told the group that he thought the men could be rescued. He wanted to know if Blackburn could arrange for a clandestine agent to be put in the area. Contrary to many impressions, agents in most of North Vietnam were a military responsibility, not the CIA's. And their missions were laid on and controlled by SACSA. Early in the 60s, President Lyndon Johnson had limited the CIA's coverage to the western part of North Vietnam, within 15 miles of the Laotian border. The CIA had a number of operating sites there, and some coverage into North Vietnam was a natural fallout, but organizing the rescue would be largely the responsibility of SACSA. So the book does document a number of details in it which just resonate with my dad, the things that I know about my dad. For instance, the special Sante knife, which is a big extended, almost a machete, but it's in the shape of a Bowie knife, but it's like extended. And the reason that I associate that with my dad is because my dad had his Marine combat knife from World War II, and he carried it around. He kept it under the driver's seat of the car. This is a big knife, like this big, and in his sheath. And but it was just he kept it there, And he's another guy I wouldn't want to unnecessarily argue with. Uh, but my mom said that he used a knife to break into things when he was in the FBI. Of course, he did black bag, or what do you call them, black bag jobs. So they would break into a office and go through the file cabinets and things. And it just the particular shape of this knife was he had a technique where he could just open things real easily with it. And I I think that's why, because if you read the accounts of the raid, both by Benjamin Shimmer and also by Admiral was it's McCraven, I think, that wrote a book about special ops. Yeah. So anyway, that that and a number of other things. Um, Reference was made. Um, I think it was Michael Lorette, one of our great commentators, was referring to this book by John Plaster, SOG, The Secret Wars of America's Commandos in Vietnam. The Special Operations Group was the first name of it, and then they quickly changed it to the Studies in Operations Group. Um, SOG was working under the command of MACV, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. And this was an arrangement that was created after Krulak was fired under Lyndon Johnson. When you have the dark side of counterinsurgency comes in, and where you have uh, a an Ed Lansdale approach as opposed to a General Victor Krulak approach. And so the CIA is now back in charge of special operations. How did they do it? Well, they did it by Lyndon Johnson appointing CIA double-hatted officers into SACSA. I guess it started with Kennedy making Maxwell Taylor the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, because I don't think Kennedy saw that Taylor was going to be undermining his efforts to get out of Vietnam. But it was, according to Prouty, it was Maxwell Taylor that started subverting the reporting and things to make it easier for Lyndon Johnson to reverse the policy of withdrawal and to, in fact, start bringing in large numbers of troops and combat troops to, try to win with divisions what they should have been trying to win with small protective operations to support the local people. And that, of course, is all part of why it looks more like the drug operation behind the scenes was really what was going on. Because if they wanted to win the war, they should have prevented the drug operations and supported the traditional families and farms and the structures of the tribal governments instead of destroying everything. So as was said, Krulak lost. He didn't win his efforts to change the doctrine in Vietnam to one of winning the hearts and minds of the people and supporting their free exercise of their human rights. The last SACSA was General Leroy Manor, Manor. I did a lot of work on General Manor's story in the first couple of years of my show, McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. And I'll try to republish that stuff. It's very tedious to republish things, especially on the newer platforms, because they don't have as much bandwidth as YouTube does. So but I'm working on it, and I have to say, Catherine, Jumping Mouse Catherine has been so wonderful to uh, keep putting all our stuff up on BitChute. So anyway, General Leroy Manor came to my dad's funeral, and he was the only and he had been in the Philippines working there, actually as the president of the Manila branch of the Nugan Bank. Now that is an inside CIA job, if there ever was one, right? So we know General Leroy Manor, Air Force general, had been involved in the CIA money laundering, for years. And he becomes the SACSA in early 1971. So he was in the Philippines when my dad died, and he came to the funeral. And among all the hundreds of military officers and other mucky mucks that were there, he was the only one that came up to us, me and my sisters, and just kind of pulled up a chair in front of us and said, your dad was a great man. And that's all we can say. And that was it. That was the last that anybody ever said about my dad's career. But now, I've had the wonderful blessing, of the time and the encouragement from you guys and from my wife. Um, and just in my own heart I had to explore this stuff. So now we know that uh, my dad was the guy that was put in that chair to run the special operations of all the services, including the CIA, in 1962, that Kennedy was assassinated, partly, I'm sure, because of his policy of wanting to get out of Vietnam, because other people had other plans for Vietnam, right? Um, but my dad, of course, is still there. He's working. He's got a family. He's got things. He has a career. He has to stay. He's working there. And so now they're working under Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson is already persuaded by other people that this counterinsurgency is nonsense. What we got to do is go in there and just roll them up with massive, overwhelming military force. And so counterinsurgency became helicopters, and counterinsurgency became, the swift boat attacks, and counterinsurgency became the SWATO, the fast boats that they were using to attack North Vietnam secretly, and try to undermine their. But how it doesn't make any sense, does it? That some boat raids on the coast would somehow undermine the confidence of the North Vietnamese people to win the war. So much of it doesn't make sense unless you put on a different set of glasses and you look at it from the point of view of who was selling those helicopters, who made all the money off of those thousands and thousands of helicopters, and you trace that back. But that's I didn't mention General Dupuy. General Dupuy was the SACSA, the other one that I didn't mention. He was between Piers and Blackburn, and he was another massive, massive airstrike, massive military involvement. And let's see, he became the SACSA on March 15th, 1967. So isn't it interesting that the TDY mission was run in the spring of 1967, and there was a gap between, I think, December of 66, when Pierce leaves, and March 15th of 67, when Dupuy comes along, it seems to me that the Joint Chiefs had put together something to try to catch the CIA and stop this destruction of our boys, in Saigon with heroin, and destruction of our cities, destruction of our youth. Um, it's it's everything. It's been at stake, and now it's our turn to stand up. Thanks for being with me tonight. Good night.